Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. This is Megan from Modern Moon Quilt Studio, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to cut with the fabric strips. I'm going to show you two different methods, one using the Stripology XL Ruler as well as a long 24-inch ruler. This is going to be especially useful for the Happy Camper quilt since that does require lots of width of fabric strips for all of the sizes. And before we get started, this is your PSA to change your rotary blade. I'm going to be changing mine here, as you can see, and it just makes your life easier, especially if it's at all dull. It's just going to keep you from having to repeat cuts. So just change it. Just do it. Change your blade and be safe about it. You can see I have a tin here where I used to keep my old blades and old needles. So just be careful while you're changing it, but get a nice sharp blade in there before you get started. Now, the first thing I recommend before cutting any fabric is to press your fabric. Give it a nice iron to get all those folds and wrinkles out. I like to maintain that center fold, and I use that when I'm cutting parallel pieces. I use that to line up my ruler. So I like to keep that in the center, so don't press that out, but everything else can get a nice press. Flip it over, get the back side. I also have really become fond of using this quilting and crafting spray from Magic. It's fragrance free, which is awesome, and it just gives everything a nice starchy crispness to it, which has really helped with my accuracy when it comes to both cutting and piecing. So I would highly recommend, definitely something that I've taken to lately, and I would highly suggest. Now that we have our fabric nice and pressed and ready for cutting, we are going to start cutting with the fabric strips. Now you'll notice that most quilt patterns will start with the cutting instructions for width of fabric, and it's usually noted as a WOF cut, and you're cutting from selvage to selvage. I like to keep the fabric folded in half, so maintaining that center fold. And the first thing you want to do is square up your fabric. So use the longest ruler you have, and I line up the short end of the ruler with the fold of the fabric to make sure that that's perfectly perpendicular. And then I cut off as little fabric as I can off the top to make sure that that's nice and square. Then I turn it around because I like to cut from the bottom working up, and I use my ruler to line up parallel with that freshly cut edge, so I know that everything is nice and straight and square. And the other reason for making sure that you are cutting perpendicular to the fold is to make sure that you're not getting any bends or elbows in the center section of fabric, because you're going to be cutting from selvage towards the center fold, and when you get to that center fold, a lot of times you can open that up, press that, and then cut another subcut of fabric. So making sure that that is perpendicular is really important. Just a little safety note here, when you're cutting, make sure that you do have all your fingertips on the ruler and nothing hanging over the edge. I want to make sure that we're being safe when we're using our rotary cutter, and want to make sure we're avoiding any accidents. So just continue moving that ruler up and making 2.5-inch cuts, just confirming that the lines on the ruler are parallel with the cut edge and perpendicular with the fold. Once you have your width of fabric strips cut, a pattern is typically going to call for those strips to be subcut. So to do that, I like to lay my strips on my cutting mat and use the grid lines to keep everything nice and parallel. You're probably picking up on a theme here. Once I have those laid out, I like to trim the selvage off, and then I work from left to right and subcut each piece to the appropriate length. For this, they need to be 6.5 inches wide. I make a cut, move down, make another 6.5-inch cut, and that is going to give me the correct 2.5 by 6.5-inch piece of fabric that I need for this pattern. And I just want to point out that it's really important that when you are making subcuts to work from the selvage to the center fold, because once you get to that fold in the center of the fabric, you can typically open that up and then make another subcut from that. Okay, now let me show you how I like to cut with the fabric strips using my Stripology XL Ruler from Creative Grids. Now to do that, I am going to fold this fabric in half from the center fold to the selvage. And what I'm trying to do here is just make it as parallel as possible. I want the center fold at the top of the screen here, parallel with the bottom fold that I'm creating at the bottom of the screen. Don't worry about lining up the cut edge that you see on the left side of the screen. We are going to trim that off and square it up. Now that you have it as parallel as you can, lay your ruler over the fabric, and now you're going to use those black and white grid lines to double check that everything's parallel. So I'm going to use that white line at the bottom, and I'm going to make sure that is parallel with the bottom fold. And then I'm going to go up to the top fold and confirm that that's also parallel with the grid lines on the ruler. And then the other thing you want to make sure is that the cut edge to the left of the screen is past the 0-inch mark, because again, we are going to make our first cut down that 0-inch mark, making sure that that first cut is nice and square. The other cool thing about this is that you see that there are different symbols at the bottom of the ruler. There's stars that denote every 1.5 inch, and the squares are for every 2.5 inch. We are making 2.5 inch cuts today for the quilt that I'm making. Now you're going to see that the bottom of the ruler, there are little teardrop shapes for the rotary cutter. So that's where you're going to insert the rotary blade at a little bit of an angle and roll it right up, making that cut. Now once we remove that ruler, we can take off that little bit off the left side, and now we have these really nice clean 2.5 inch wide strips of fabric that we can then turn around and subcut into whatever we need for our pattern. Now that we have all of our width of fabric strips cut, we can lay those out and subcut those into the correct sizes that are specific for the quilt pattern. So to do that, I start laying them out on my mat, and I use the grid lines just to make sure that I'm keeping everything lined up and parallel with each other. Usually I overlap them about 1 inch or so, making sure again that I'm just following those grid lines, and I lay 3 or 4 down at a time. And you don't want to stack them all right on top of each other because the fabric's going to get too thick to cut through. So just staggering them about every inch or so works great. Then lay the ruler back on top of all those with the fabric strips, using those grid lines to keep everything nice and lined up and parallel. Once you have everything nice and lined up, then you can go ahead and trim off the selvage by making your first cut on that 0-inch mark, and then going down to whatever length that you need. For this, I need an 8.5 inch subcut, so I put it in the 8.5 inch mark, roll the rotary cutter up the slot of the ruler to make that cut, and then do the second one at the 17-inch mark, so I'm able to get 2 subcuts from this. But because my fabric is all doubled up, each of those is 2 cuts, so I have 16 total 2.5 by 8.5 inch pieces of fabric that I can then go and use to piece my blocks. The Stripology ruler makes it super quick and easy to cut not only with the fabric strips, but also subcut that into smaller units. It makes really fast work of all this cutting. When it comes to cutting wider strips of fabric, like the 11-inch with the fabric strips I need for this background fabric, I like to once again fold the fabric in half lengthwise, and ensuring that the fold from the center is parallel with the new fold that I'm creating at the bottom of the screen. Once I ensure that the 2 folds are parallel with each other as best I can, I line up the cut edge to the left with the 0-inch mark on my cutting mat. Then I line up the edge of the ruler with the lines on the cutting mat. So I'm measuring the fabric with the cutting mat as opposed to the ruler. I find this is much easier when it comes to cutting these wider widths of fabric rather than trying to fumble around with the ruler. I always like to double check my widths before I do any cutting. I'll just count down the marks on my mat, do my 1 cut, and then from there I keep all the fabric in place and just slide the ruler down to do my second cut. And don't forget to label your cut pieces of fabric. Most of my quilt patterns come with quilt labels that are specific to the pattern. Keeping everything labeled and organized is going to help you be able to find the correct pieces when you need them and make piecing so much easier. You can cut them out and either pin them or clip them to the stacks of fabric, and you're good to go. Alright friends, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions, just leave a comment below and I will do my best to answer all questions and help you as much as I can when it comes to cutting fabric. And I will link all the products featured in this video in the description, so make sure to check that out. If you're looking for the Stripology ruler, I'll have a link to that as well. I absolutely love mine. It saves me so much time when it comes to cutting fabric. I would definitely suggest investing in it, especially if you find yourself cutting a lot of strips of fabric like this. If you'd like to see more videos like this, just make sure to subscribe to my channel. Happy quilting, friends!